Tuk-tuk, on y va,
Okay.
Jérôme?
Okay.
On se présente en français et puis après je te laisse introduire en anglais.
Ouais, ok, donc nous allons reprendre pour cette deuxième session qui s'appelle Trajectoires terrestres, Être prises avec la Terre et ses milieux. Je vais essayer de la traduire. Terrestrial Trajectories, ça c'est facile. Être prises avec la Terre et ses milieux, je ne m'y lance pas. Donc pour cette session, nous allons passer en anglais, hein, mais nous accueillons trois conférences. La première va être donnée par Mark Williams. Donc Mark Williams est professeur de paléobiologie à l'université de... Je ne sais jamais comment ça se prononce. Leicester. Is that the correct pronunciation? Et il a beaucoup travaillé, il est très actif, il est très connu sur la question de l'anthropocène et la définition d'anthropocène. Et aujourd'hui, il nous apporte le point de vue d'un géologue. I think we can say that you're a geologist. And you're probably proud of it. Et il a beaucoup travaillé avec Jan Zalasiewicz, qui est un ami du Centre des politiques de la Terre, et Colin Waters également. Et donc, je disais que Marc va nous apporter le point de vue, on va dire, long terme, hein, un peu comme Boris tout à l'heure, sur l'évolution de la biosphère en tentant de définir des proxys, c'est-à-dire des index. Et ensuite, nous aurons le plaisir d'entendre Clémence Gaden-Rosfelder et Julia Lenoé, qui sont respectivement doctorantes à l'EHESS en histoire rurale, histoire environnementale et études des sciences de l'agriculture, et Julia, qui est à ma gauche, qui est chargée de recherche à l'Institut de recherche et développement à Sorbonne Université. Et elles vont développer des concepts sur lesquels elles ont beaucoup travaillé, des concepts de métabolisme socio-écologique. Donc on voit là le parallèle avec l'approche précédente qui sera développée au niveau géologique, à plus grandes échelles de temps et plus grandes échelles d'espace. Et enfin, nous aurons, mais elle n'est pas autour de la table car elle a eu un accident de vélo, c'est décidément la période des accidents de vélo. Comme Christophe a eu un accident de vélo, oui. Camille Besombes, qui, elle, est médecin de formation, épidémiologique à l'Institut de recherche et de développement à Montpellier, qui va être recrutée, d'ailleurs ce n'est plus un scoop, comme postdoc à Sciences Po. C'est encore un scoop, Sandrine? Bon, non. Je suis connu pour ne pas être capable de tenir ma langue. Voilà. Et Camille va nous parler de l'approche One Health, des études qu'elle a réalisées sur les maladies infectieuses émergentes. Donc là aussi, on est dans la recherche de proxy, une certaine forme de quantification des territoires terrestres. So this is my pleasure to let the floor to Mark Williams. So now we are going to speak in English, and the discussion will be in English. Sorry about that.
Yes, you can go there. I can see it.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to such an interesting and eclectic conference. I enjoyed the talks. I can't understand so much French, I'm sorry, but I could follow the talks this morning. Very good to see those. We wanted to pose the question to you, is it possible to develop an index of habitability for planet Earth? It's important because at present, humans, some humans particularly, are interfering with the broader processes of the biosphere, and therefore potentially pushing the biosphere towards a state where it becomes much less stable. We also think it's important to think about habitability on planet Earth because it may be the only, it is the only model that we have at present for life in the universe. And listening to Boris's talk this morning, I think this will hopefully be a bit of a kind of sister presentation to yours. I wanted to start really with this image because it's a very evocative, provocative image. That's planet Earth, taken from 6 billion kilometers out in space as the Voyager 1 spacecraft left our solar system on the 14th of February 1990 And you probably know the famous quote from Carl Sagan about that being the place where everyone you've ever known and everyone you'll ever know lives. Because as far as we know, that's the only place in the universe that harbours life. And there it sits, that tiny speck, that tiny cosmic oasis, sitting in a desert of space. So it's important to think about habitability on planet Earth from this perspective also. It is important for us to think about habitability over geological timescales. Boris has already talked about this in the first talk this morning. It's important because current extinction levels are high, and therefore we may be able to get some comparisons with deep time geological processes of extinction. We know that ecosystems on our planet now show irreversible change in many cases, and also that pattern of change is accelerating. It's not decelerating, it's getting worse from the perspective of biodiversity, certainly at the local scale of ecosystems. So it's important to think about habitability from a past perspective as a potential comparison with what's happening at present. Where we are now, we're not yet in a mass extinction event, but we're very, very close to it, as I hope I'll demonstrate as some of the figures as we go through this talk. That's where we are now. That's where we might be within a couple of centuries. Within a few human generations, we may push the biosphere to a mass extinction state. And you can see the recovery time there, arbitrary units, but actually as geologists we can measure that. We can tell you that's going to be millions of years for the Earth system, for the biosphere to recover. It's a lot of time. Now, questions about habitability are fraught. I think Boris has already kind of talked about this in the first presentation, because as we know, different types of biosphere have occurred on planet Earth through time. There are different scales of temporality if you're trying to think about the past versus the present. You're looking at a fossil record which may be averaged over thousands or tens of thousands of years, whereas we can observe directly around us extinctions. There are different drivers of habitability as the biosphere has evolved over time. And also we need to think about this problem at the scale of the local, where ecosystems are already in many cases collapsed catastrophically, to the global. And it's the global that I'm going to emphasize today because that's the comparison that we can make with the deep time. Now, the approach needs to be simple and accessible if we're trying to make comparisons between deep time and present. So forgive me if I do simplify some of the complexity in this. Now, parameters of habitability have clearly changed on our planet over the 4.5 billion years of our planet and the 4 billion years where the biosphere has probably existed on this planet. So as we go through time, the biosphere has changed very dramatically. Even if we were to focus on the past 500 million years, we would still have to factor in major changes. And this is just a snippet, a small part of geological time, because if we went back 500 million years, we would find a wonderfully diverse ocean biosphere, like the one shown there on the left. But we wouldn't find a very diverse terrestrial biosphere. That only really started to evolve from about 480 million years ago. So these are different states of our biosphere that we have to factor in, even in relatively recent geological time. I'm talking as a geologist. What are the end members then? Again, a bit of overlap with you, Boris. We're going to assign an index 5 to the present biosphere in terms of its configuration as a highly biodiverse marine and terrestrial global ecology. We're going to assign a 0 index to a planet like Mars, where it's highly unlikely there's a biosphere at the surface of that planet. And then we're going to have a look at the kind of different gradations in between these. Now, forgive this horribly complex figure. I'm going to try and summarize this for you, and this is picking up really from where Boris left off, going through the evolution of the biosphere over time and that very, very close interaction between the environment and the biosphere. This is a figure we drafted for an Anthropocene paper a few years ago. If you go back to the early Earth, it too has an index 0 because it does not have a biosphere at its inception and probably doesn't have a biosphere for the first 500 million years. And then we go through a whole series of stages from more primitive to more complex biosphere states. You can see we've assigned an index 1 to the early microbial biosphere based on simple prokaryotic cells. We've added an index 2 to a simple biosphere that uses oxygenic photosynthesis. And as geologists, we could probably argue endlessly about how we define these different biosphere states, but this is a reasonably good hypothesis to work on. We could go to an index 3 biosphere, one where those simple cells have started to cooperate through endosymbiosis. We heard about Lynn Margolis this morning. She's a great thinker of the 20th and early 21st century. This is a cooperation between simple cells to make more complex cells, the kind of cells that make up our bodies, eukaryotic cells. And then we go forward in time again to about 600 million years ago, and we start to see widespread multicellularity and all of the opportunities for diversity that presents. We'll call that an index 4 type biosphere. And then we have to come forward a little bit further in time to about 480 million years ago, when that biosphere starts to expand from the oceans onto the land. That's our index 5 type biosphere, the complex biosphere that we have at present. Now, the interesting thing is that once the scaffolding for that index 5 type biosphere is assembled, once all the interconnections are made between the ecosystems at local scale and at a regional and at a global scale, it becomes very, very resilient to change, which is good for the biosphere. That means we can damage it, we can attack it, but it's very difficult to knock it down, at least in the time frames that we're working from here. In the far distant future, then that's obviously possible as the sun begins to warm up. So once it's reconfigured, it's configured in this index 5 type way, it is very resilient to change, as I'll try to demonstrate to you. The scaffolding becomes complexly intertwined. For plants on land, as you know, there is a very, very close relationship between plants and fungi in ecosystems. They cohabit, they cooperate. Sometimes the fungi are parasitic, but often they're symbiotic. We can actually see these interwoven ecosystems developing in the fossil record. So this is a very famous fossil locality called the Rhynie Chert in Scotland. And here you have some of the earliest examples of early land plants preserved in a fossilized lake from 410 million years ago. And there you have the plant, and there you have the fungi. Very, very close symbiosis between these organisms right at the inception. And it's, of course, there's that closely interwoven ecology that is conferring resilience to our ecologies and ecosystems. So if I've said to you that this index 5 biosphere is resilient to change, what can affect it? What can actually perturb it? There are lots of different things we can talk about in this context. This is a paper that we published a year back looking at perturbations to the Earth system over geological timescales. The kinds of things that can damage an index 5 type biosphere are the things that you know about. Big bolide impacts like the asteroid strike 66 million years ago, or prolonged volcanic eruptions over hundreds of thousands of years. That can cause a major perturbation to the biosphere. We can add a new one to this one, though. Some humans, those with patterns of hyperconsumption, not all humans, but those of us in this room, those of us living in wealthy Western countries, are hyper-consumers. And we are damaging the broader Earth system. So we'll add that to this figure also. Let's just have a look at some of the perturbations to this index 5 type biosphere over the past 500 million years. Let's start with the earliest one. This is the late Ordovician extinction that occurred about 440 million years ago. Quite frightening when you look at the figures. The fossil record tells us that up to 86% of marine species went extinct. Not much of a terrestrial biosphere at this time. Its causes appear to be major climate change and a whole concomitant array of effects, ocean anoxia, etc. Its duration, 2 episodes, not everybody agrees, perhaps over hundreds of thousands of years. But peak extinction is probably much smaller. The thing I want you to notice is the recovery time, millions of years. The end Permian extinction, this is the one which is often referred to as the Great Dying. 80 to 90% of known species went extinct. Some have estimated 95% of species have gone extinct. Its causes, sustained volcanic eruptions, a whole range of concomitant effects like ocean anoxia, acid rain, large-scale deforestation. Sounds familiar. Its duration, some estimates suggest 60,000 years, so really quite a sharp pulse. But the thing to notice again, recovery time, millions of years. Now, as paleontologists and geologists, we can document that recovery in huge detail. So this is some very good work done a decade ago. And here you're looking at a range of sea marine communities from the late Permian, just before the extinction, through into the early Triassic, immediately after the extinction, and then going forward millions of years into the Triassic. So here you can see a very diverse late Permian marine community, with everything from the primary producers up to the tertiary consumers in that ecosystem. After the extinction, most things have gone extinct. Generalists, survivors, just clinging on for dear life. And that recovery, that survival phase takes a long time, talking millions of years here, millions of years to go into this recovery phase, perhaps 7 million years to get back to an ecology as diverse as that of the late Permian. So big time frame. The end Cretaceous extinction, everybody's heard of this because this is the one that wipes out the non-bird dinosaurs. But it wiped out a lot of other things also. 75% of known species, land and sea, almost certainly caused by a bolide impact, but probably other influences also. Its duration, very quick, sudden. And there we go again, recovery time, millions of years. The last of the extinctions I'm going to talk about with you is the Petam extinction. Maybe less familiar to most folks. This occurred 56 million years ago. It's a smaller scale extinction. Only some groups of organisms suffered a mass extinction or a major extinction. This group, the benthic foraminifera, tiny single-celled sea creatures, lost about 50% of their biodiversity. But this one's really important because we also lost a lot of structural diversity in ecosystems, particularly the loss of coral reefs. Its duration, thousands of years, quite short. Recovery time, millions of years. And you can see that very clearly on this figure, sorry for the graph here. On the vertical axis here, you have reef volume in the oceans. This is time coming through the Permian, right through to near the present. There's the Permian Triassic extinction. We're not going to worry about that now, but there was a big reef gap there, several million years. And here's the Petam extinction, probably caused by rapid release of carbon to the atmosphere, global warming, ocean acidification, increased temperatures of the oceans, and a massive collapse in reefs, often seen as a model for what's happening at present. And this is the state that we may approach by the middle part of the 21st century if we continue with our CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. And you can see millions of years for recovery. What do we conclude? So at the global scale, none of these big events, even a massive asteroid strike, wiped out the biosphere, or indeed reduced it to a more primitive state. It survived in this Index 5 biosphere state. Some episodes had small effects on the biosphere, others had much larger impacts on the biosphere, perhaps 90% of species diversity in some cases. But what we can see is that an Index 5 biosphere can exist in 3 clear states, and probably several more. This is a project we've just started. We want to examine this in a lot more detail. It's got a low biodiversity state. I've demonstrated that to you. An intermediate recovery substate and a high biodiversity substate. We're currently in that state, the high biodiversity substate, which exists generally for tens of millions of years. Current extinction is related to translocation, reconfiguration, appropriation, and concentration, all of which result in massive habitat loss at the global scale. What do we mean by this? Translocation. Recent paper by Hanno Siebens and his group at the Senckenberg in Germany, just documenting the translocation of species on our planet. Tens of thousands of them, many of them invasive, and often causing extinction when they get into indigenous ecologies. Concentration. The most recent estimates suggest that you and I and the animals that we consume are 98% of the terrestrial mammal biomass, which is a shocking figure for any species to dominate biomass in that way. Appropriation. Again, recent figures suggest that we've reduced the mass of the biosphere by about 50% over the past 10,000 years. So we as a species reduce the mass of life on this planet by 50% over the past 10,000 years. Reconfiguration, massive reconfiguration of ecosystems across the planet. Here in Kalimantan in Indonesia, there is the indigenous rainforest, and here is the oil palm plantations that are spreading very rapidly across this island. The disturbance is huge. It's huge at a global scale. Half the habitable land surface is used for farming by humans. So the analogy is this, that you and I are not yet the asteroid strike, but we are approaching. We're detectable in space. We're nearby and about to hit the Earth. That's where humanity stands, with some humans obviously much, much more responsible than this and some not responsible at all. In its latter stages, extinction is now advancing very rapidly. It's way, way above background extinction levels, which we can measure by looking at species durations in the geological record. We're not yet in a mass extinction, but all of these groups, as you can see, these are the extinctions. These are the species now susceptible to extinction. We're approaching a position where we will cause a mass extinction within a few human generations. It's going to be associated with climate change, ocean acidification, the spread of ocean anoxia, rapid degradation of natural landscapes, air, land and sea pollution, all factors that in fact I could invoke for deep time extinctions as well, what I've demonstrated to you as we've gone through this summary today. We may get to the mass extinction phase very soon if we don't intervene, within a few generations of humans. For some groups, it's already very late. So this is a recent study, a very good study, on mollusk extinctions that suggests perhaps 13% of species have gone extinct since the 1500s. That's an incredible figure to think about. So this group are already in the beginnings of a major extinction event, and many others, of course, are the same. Or we can intervene. Another version of soon, where we've intervened to prevent this loss of habitability on our planet. The biosphere still has a remarkable propensity to recover all around us. This is a woodland near to me. It's called Cloud Wood. And it was there 1,000 years ago from historical records. And then in the 1940s, it was cut down completely, clear-felled, not a single tree standing. And for good measure, the quarry next door to it dumped all of its quarry waste on top of it as well. So the forest was almost obliterated. In 70 years, by being left alone, it's recovered. It's now one of the most biodiverse regions in the area of Leicestershire in England where I live. Over 200 species interacting. There's still a really good chance for the biosphere to bounce back if we intervene. The alternative is, if we carry on with the present trajectory, we shift the biosphere, its index 5 will survive, whoops, but it will go towards its low diversity survival state. And it's very close to getting there now. And I've demonstrated what that means to you from the geological record. In that scenario, recovery may take millions of years. Some organisms, the generalists on our planet, those able to survive in a whole range of different habitats, will survive, of course. And they will go on to diversify millions of years into the future. If you know this book, Dougal Dixon's After Humans, should be After Humans, of course, then these are rabbits. Rabbits are descended from rabbits, and they've proliferated and radiated into a whole range of different environments. That might be the future in 3 or 4 million years' time. Either way, this goes. Loss of habitat resulting in an Anthropocene mass extinction, or you and I, as a species, intervening to develop a kind of more mutually beneficial relationship with the Earth. We have fundamentally changed the Earth system, and we've fundamentally changed the biosphere. Through this, it would be a mass extinction. Through this, it would be a wholly new state of the biosphere. One could argue, in fact, that if this persists, this would become our index 6 type biosphere of human biosphere interactions, but one, hopefully, that shows signs of recovery. Those ecosystems will be very changed. Thank you very much for listening to me.
So now it's our pleasure to welcome Julia Lenoé, who will talk about testing the concept of social ecological metabolism through the practice of interdisciplinarity, and with the case of agricultural modernization in Brittany over the 19th century. The stage is yours.
So hi everyone, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to present this talk today. So this communication offers to analyze the agricultural history of Brittany since 1892, it's not 1950, sorry for that, with the interdisciplinarity approach of socio-ecological metabolism. So from a conceptual point of view, we claim here the eco-Marxist heritage of the concept of socio-ecological metabolism, which aims to articulate a biophysical sphere to a biophysical sphere without assimilating one to the other. So indeed, the concept came from Marx and has very much to do with the idea of labor, because as the citation show here, the labor process is the appropriation of natural substances to human requirements. It is the necessary condition for effecting exchange of matters between man and nature. So in this perspective, what is important to have in mind now is that the preferred type of object of study, are the material fluxes existing between geographically and historically located societies and their biophysical environment. So this is what we will be interested in today. So this prism of analysis implies a fundamentally interdisciplinary approach. So as you can see here, like this is, the socio-ecological metabolism of Midi-Pyrénées and Ile-de-France as described by Sabine Barl. So in our case, the practice of interdisciplinarity consists in hybridizing approach from environmental history, in particular to analyze the social logic managing and shaping the arrangement of material fluxes in agricultural systems, and from biogeochemical analysis methods, which studies the biogeochemical processes that mediate the material fluxes we are interested in. So here, in this case, we will be interested in the public policies of agricultural modernization that took place in Brittany, and which we will analyze from the angle of the biogeochemical fluxes of nitrogen. So nitrogen is an element that is both key for life on Earth, but that can also result in environmental damage and health issue. So I'll come back on that later. Yes. So the choice of Brittany seems particularly relevant to us because it represents the archetypal case of very proactive public policies and private initiatives which have made it one of the most important agricultural regions of France in crop production, but mostly in the field of livestock farming. So indeed, starting in the 1950s, Brittany developed a great agri-food network upstream and downstream. And as a result, Brittany is today the source of 56% of the national pig production, 40% of the national production of both meat and egg-laying poultry, and 20% of the national milk production. So in this presentation, I will first present the trajectory of the agricultural metabolism of Brittany since 1850 from a socio-political and socio-ecological angle. Secondly, Clémence will analyze the implementation and distortion of these policies through the study of the trajectories of 3 farms that have followed different development. And thirdly, and lastly, if we still have time for that, Clémence will present how the historical analysis have allowed us to consider different development scenarios for Brittany based on an interdisciplinary seminar that we have put in place since September 2021 between the École Normale Supérieure and École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. So, why are we interested in nitrogen? And why are we going to use this element to investigate the socio-ecological metabolism of Brittany's agriculture? So the duality of the nitrogen elements, both vital and harmful in the environment, makes it possible to express the tension between agricultural production and the preservation of the ecological conditions necessary for this, for the production and reproduction of present and future livelihoods. So indeed, nitrogen is an extremely mobile element in the environment. So in the form of inert diazote, dinitrogen, so is a very, it's very inert, but it can be used by some organisms, so that are leguminous, nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are in symbiosis with leguminous to become ammonia and nitrate, which can then be utilized by other forms of life, and in particular by plants in the environment. And this small molecule of nitrate and ammonium, when they are used by plants, then they can become organic nitrogen in the form of protein, nucleic acid, and so on. And this can then be appropriated by other organisms, and including human organisms that use organic nitrogen in the forms of protein to build their own organic matter, then their own protein. So the soil nitrogen is an essential element of the soil nitrogen is an essential element for plant growth drawn from the soil solution. But as I was saying just before, the excess of nitrogen can also be harmful to the environment. So when nitrite and ammonium are in too large quantity that can be used by plant or microorganisms, they are likely to be leached into aquatic environment and lead to the eutrophication of water bodies and impact other biological processes leading to biodiversity loss following eutrophication. So one important thing that I forgot to mention is that these processes of transferring atmospheric nitrogen from the inert form in atmosphere to the reactive form in the biosphere has also been developed by industrial process, the Haber-Bosch process, since the World War I. And this process has made it possible to increase, very importantly, the agricultural yields, but at the same time introduce double the total quantity of reactive nitrogen on Earth, and which thus led to also increasing the nitrogen leaking in the environment. So I am a bit lost in my slide. Something important with nitrogen in the agriculture is that agricultural system, contrarily to forestry system, are open systems. So this means that every year we export plants through harvest, and so having nitrogen input to the soil is indispensable. If you don't have, the soil will be very poor, and then this will be terrible for yield and for livelihood conditions. So in any case, there needs to be nitrogen input to the soil, and this can be done through organic amendment or nitrogen fixation by the presence of leguminous in crop rotation. But the nitrogen fertilizer tends to also replace those two sources of biological or organic nitrogen and allow to specialize cropping system. So yes, this is the nitrogen cascade. I'm going, yes. So yes. So now something that is very important to us today is that to account for these nitrogen fluxes in agricultural system, we have used a systematic grid analysis, that is the graphs model. So this is the graphs model here that you can see. So that means a generalized representation of agro-food system, which makes it possible to synthetically represent the nitrogen fluxes in agricultural systems. So this approach considers 4 compartments, so cropland, grassland, livestock system, population, and the surrounding environment through which nitrogen is flowing. So this approach is based on a detailed assessment of the nitrogen fluxes involved in the production, processing and consumption of animal and plant products in a territory, as well as the associated environmental links. So by formalizing the links between those different compartments, the graphs approach makes it possible to establish a direct link between different aspects of the hydro-agri-food system, such as between diet, the productive structure of the territory, and trade. So based on the agricultural statistics available since 1822, this approach has made it possible to reconstruct the trajectory of the Breton agricultural modernization. And we have been able to highlight 3 biogeochemical periods, each different from the previous one by breaks in terms of disruption of the nitrogen cycle. So please note in what follows that the nitrogen fluxes, the hours, are proportional to the quantity of nitrogen flowing from one compartment to another. So these results are based on the reconstitution of the socio-ecological metabolism of agriculture in Brittany, based on the statistical agricultural statistics that are all available. And these that you can see close are some socioeconomic diagrams of the main characteristic of the Brittany agriculture that allows to understand the socio-ecological metabolism in relation to this socioeconomic evolution. So a first period were identified from 1822 to the end of to before World War II, and this first period can be identified by is characterized by an agricultural system in which a biogeochemical functioning on a territorial scales reveals a complementarity between livestock and plant production. So you see there is a close integration also in the late 19th century, but also in 1929, a close integration between livestock breeding activity and cropland, which relies on each other. And so during this period, we can compare the evolution. There is a slow increase in livestock density that allows a gradual increase in agricultural yields, thanks to the increase of manure input, as well as increase, as you can see here, in labor force. So it's interesting that in that period, there is not a decline in the agricultural workers. Workers include both draft animal and human. But there is an increase, and in particular in wage earning workers, which can be interpreted as a first intensification of agriculture through intensification of labor. So the next period, from the end of World War II to the end of the 80s, can be seen as a second biogeochemical period, which is characterized by the doubling of the livestock numbers and the phenomenal increase in the use of mineral fertilizer, which can be surprising because there is also increase in livestock. And so we may wonder, why do we need to increase nitrogen fertilizer input while there is so much manure? And then maybe the answer will be given by Clémence after me. So this evolution that I just pointed out have dramatic consequences on the environment, which I also presented before, and goes together with a dramatic shrink this time in agricultural labor, as well as an important decrease in the number of farms, and also an increase of the average size of farm. And this evolution also of the socioeconomic structure are very much related to the change in the socio-ecological metabolism, because they are required to implement the new agricultural techniques of specializations. So for specialization to occur, there needs to be larger farms with less farmers. And even though the farms must remain exploitable by a couple of farmers. So these evolutions were made possible by a set of scientific, institutional, economic, and political incentives. So, namely, the creation of the National Institute for Agronomic Research in 1946 and of the Catalogue of Authorized Wet Varieties, the Plan of Modernization d'Équipement in the 1947 to 1953, and the Marshall Plan in 1948, which allowed the purchase of the first tractor, as well as a bit later the two Lois d'orientation agricole and the Common Agricultural Policy, which very much strive these changes and puts in place many incentives to this specialization to occur. So the last period is marked by a certain paradox in Brittany. So on the one hand, there is a decrease in mineral fertilizer inputs, finally, but on the other hand, there is a deepening of the specialization in animal breeding made possible by the increase in animal feed and the ever-growing size of farm size that comes together with an ever-declining numbers of farmers. So this specialization is accompanied by a greater opening of the nitrogen cycle due to the further insertion of the agricultural production of Brittany within the national and global agricultural market. So you have noticed that animal production now relies on the heavily fertilized soils of South America to feed Breton livestock, in particular pigs, and produce structural surpluses of slurry which contaminate groundwaters and coastal areas. So Brittany has become the main livestock breeding region in France.
So this territorial specialization is a process that aggregates kind of a diversity of individual situations. Specialization trajectories occur in a unique way at the scale of each farm. So to understand what the agricultural modernization actually entails, one must study different modernizing trajectories at a farm level. Such an analysis makes it possible to shed light on the interactions between local contingencies, individual stories and choices, and economic and political structures which constrain the orientation followed by the metabolic trajectories on each Breton farm. In this respect, the different evolutions of pig farming seem to be a good illustration of the plurality of modernizations that unfolded between 1950 and 2000. The Breton pig herd went from an average of 16 pigs per breeder in 1966 to 112 in 1980 to 1,420 in 2010. And today, most pig farms are industrial farms, where pigs are bred in closed buildings with small areas of land. And the breeders buy most of their feed from cooperatives, which they themselves either import from somewhere else in France or from South America. In order to highlight the plurality of modernization trajectories, we've chosen to follow the metabolic development of 3 pig farms during the second half of the 20th century. These 3 farms made different modernizing choices. leading to each time a different metabolic development, as we'll see. So following the time frame segmentation that Julia explained in the first section of this talk, we chose to focus on 3 moments in the lives of these 3 farms. First in 1960, then in 1980, and then in 2000. So Farm 1 is owned by a couple of farmers who inherited the farm from the husband's parents in 1962. They owned about 20 hectares, about 8 dairy cows, and a few sows, which produced pigs that they would fatten, about 20 per year. These pigs were fed on cabbage, beetroot, and the yearly excess of cereals, so whatever amount that wasn't consumed by the family. Unable to get access to land, the couple turned very quickly to what is called in France hors sol, élevage hors sol, so above ground is a possible translation for this type of animal production, buying nearly all their feed to pig cooperatives, thus specializing in pig production and getting rid of their cows. All of their manure would go on their soil in 1960. Don't really know how to point with this laser, but there you go. Careful with money and trying to be as little dependent on banks and bank loans as they could. They made sure they could pay for every new building that they had built up front. Their production never increased greatly compared to the rest of the Brittany region. They had about 50 sows in 1980 with an annual production of about 1,250 fatteners, hogs, 110 sows in 2000 with an annual production about 3,000 hogs. Their nitrogen surplus amounted to only 10 kilogram per hectare per year in 1980 and 20 kilogram per hectare per year in 2000, which is when they exported about 30% of their manure production. So that means that they put it on a neighbor's land. And not having access to land also meant them heavily relying on external feed. So the vast majority of their pig feed wasn't from their own crops, but was bought from the cooperative. Farm 2 developed pig breeding in the 1960s as well, joined a pig cooperative in 1969, and specialized in pig farming in 1982, so also letting go of dairy cow farming. Originally 16 hectares big, this farm managed to acquire land and to reach 45 hectares in 1980, nearly all of it cultivated. The yield from the farmland was not enough to feed the pig production, so the farm thus had to buy, again, most of its feed from outside, from the pig cooperative. The farm produced 1,100 hogs annually. All of them were sold to the pig cooperative. This pig production produced enough nitrate to fertilize the land, resulting in a surplus, about 14 kilogram per hectare per year in 1980, and 40 kilogram per hectare per year in 2000. The farm managed to acquire still more land and reach 160 hectares in 2000, cultivating all of it. The yield is clearly not enough for all of its pig production, and the farm has still today to buy most of its, vast majority of its feed. And its pig production reached 8,500 hogs in 2000. All of them were sold to the pig cooperative. Finally, Farm 3 is thankfully quite an uncommon farm by the size it reached by 2000. Also owned by a couple of farmers. Farm 3 started with about 30 hectares, cultivating about half of it, and 6 sows, selling the pig nicks, so they chose not to fatten them, which is another question, really. It made the choice to go full on into pig production at a very intense level, getting a new building pretty much every 2-3 years, basically, but not prioritizing land buying. So it reached 60 hectares in 1980 and 130 hectares in 2000. which is actually quite a decent size for Brittany, but not for its pig and also manure production. So it therefore had to buy all of its feed from the cooperative, which represented huge amounts. And the nitrogen surplus therefore also reached a phenomenal amount. As you can see on the graphs, we've got it produced in 1980, 82 kilograms per hectare per year, and 122 kilograms per hectare per year in 2000, as the farm reached 500 sows and 12,500 hogs per year in 1980, and 800 sows and 21,600 hogs per year in 2000. So at least the only good part is that this farm never used synthetic fertilizers. I'm not exactly sure how we are for time. On en est où au niveau du 2 minutes? Right, I really haven't got time to to talk to you about. Maybe I'll go really quickly on this, but basically, just as in conclusion, the difference between the metabolic trajectory of Brittany that we saw right before, so here, and the one that we can observe at a farm's level shows us that it's really crucial to go deeper in a way, and not to stop at the regional level. There is pollution and there is unsustainable feed importation here, but when you study the farms, it's impossible not to see how unsustainable the path that they've chosen is. And therefore, once you've studied all the choices of the past, come questions of what could be done for the future. So this is why, and I'll just talk for maybe 30 seconds about it, we've put in place an interdisciplinary seminar with Julia here, Gilles Bilen, Christophe Bonneuil, Céline Pessis, and myself. So an interdisciplinary seminar between the École Normale Supérieure and the EHESS, trying to think about past trajectories of some territories in France and choices that could be done for the future in order to have kind of a more sustainable path and trajectory for a very kind of near future, so that we pollute less and have maybe better quality food, and all these questions that obviously are incredibly crucial now in 2023. So I'll just stop there. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Super, merci beaucoup. Donc encore une fois, désolée de ne pas pouvoir être avec vous. L'idée, donc là, ça va être d'essayer de repenser le concept plus d'habitabilité, mais en termes de santé, santé humaine, santé animale et santé de l'écosystème. Et c'est surtout des réflexions un peu théoriques qui reviennent sur les conceptions actuelles de la santé en termes de maladies infectieuses, et puis quelques exemples de travaux empiriques, notamment sur l'échinococcus auxquels j'ai pu participer. Donc l'idée, c'est d'essayer de repenser ces maladies infectieuses émergentes depuis les milieux pour tenter de reterritorialiser la santé. Alors, slide, pardon. Donc, les émergences infectieuses se multiplient, hein, elles sont un peu partout, que ce soit le SARS-CoV-2 en 2019, le monkeypox en 2022, les différentes épidémies d'Ebola, l'actuelle crise de grippe aviaire en Europe, la maladie de Lyme, elles sont partout. Donc, slide. Et ces émergences, elles reposent la question en fait de l'habitabilité en termes de santé, notamment avec le changement climatique. Hein, donc, on le sait, il y a la fonte du permafrost en Arctique qui libère des virus comme celui de la variole ou des bactéries comme l'anthrax qu'on verra ensuite. Il y a le réchauffement et la globalisation des échanges qui font que les vecteurs, que ce soit des tiques, des moustiques, se répartissent sur les continents et montent au nord, et donc exposent des populations naïves à ces maladies à une transmission. Et puis plus récemment, hein, cet article en bas à droite, où en fait le changement climatique, en faisant probablement migrer des espèces sauvages, va créer des potentiels échanges viraux entre espèces qui d'habitude ne se côtoient pas, ce qui pourrait encore aggraver les choses. Slide, s'il vous plaît. Et donc face à tout cela, face à ces émergences, on est dans un paradigme actuel hein, qui considère qu'un agent infectieux égale une maladie et que la présence est quand même relativement suffisante et qui détache un peu les maladies des conditions d'émergence dans une forme de biologie universelle. Et pourtant, on le sait, hein, si un microbe, un agent infectieux est nécessaire à une émergence, il n'est pas suffisant. Ça réitère l'importance des contextes socio-écologiques à chaque étape de l'émergence, qu'il s'agisse du spillover, donc du passage de l'animal à l'humain initial, mais aussi du passage en épidémie et en pandémie. Slide, s'il vous plaît. Et donc, en parallèle de cette appréhension des maladies, les réponses qui sont données à ces maladies infectieuses sont portées avec une conception biomédicale et biosécuritaire qui étudie plutôt et qui lutte contre chaque maladie en silo, hein, chaque maladie l'une après l'autre, qui donne une réponse plutôt curative et de court terme et basée sur des principes hygiénistes et biosécuritaires. Hein. On le voit sur ces images, qui est basée sur la mise en place de barrières pour empêcher le passage de sangliers porteurs de maladies d'un pays à un autre, ou sur l'abattage préventif ou curatif d'élevage. Ces approches, elles peuvent être qualifiées d'antibiotiques, donc littéralement contraires à la vie. Slide, s'il vous plaît. Mais on voit bien, hein, avec cette appréhension-là des maladies infectieuses émergentes, qui est centrée sur ces agents infectieux, en fait, on oublie un petit peu les déterminants des émergences. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait de ces déterminants qui sont pourtant maintenant bien acquis, hein, qu'il s'agisse de la déforestation, de la fragmentation des habitats de la faune sauvage, de la conversion de l'usage des terres massives pour l'agriculture, comme on nous a parlé juste avant, ou encore des transports globaux. Donc, cette conception centrée sur les agents infectieux masque ces déterminants. Slide suivante. Et tout cela nous invite à réinterroger ces émergences, cette fois depuis les agents infectieux, hein, non plus depuis les agents infectieux, pardon, mais depuis les environnements. Et en effet, ces agents infectieux sont déjà usuellement et communément appelés agents pathogènes, hein, alors que c'est quelque chose de relativement abusif, puisque, comme peut nous le montrer le récent tournant microbien en sciences humaines et sociales et en biologie, qui reconnaît la place des microbes et des agents infectieux comme alliés nécessaires de l'humain au fonctionnement de la vie humaine et au fonctionnement de la vie de la planète. Donc, on le voit bien, cette appellation agent pathogène, elle révèle déjà certaines façons de penser. Et donc là, l'idée, ce sera de réinterroger ces émergences, mais au prisme des environnements, au prisme des milieux. Donc, slide suivant. Et voir ce que ça induit, à partir de quoi on pense depuis les milieux, et voir ce que ça pourra induire. Donc, slide suivante encore. Donc, l'idée est de renouveler les hypothèses de recherche autour des maladies infectieuses émergentes, et notamment en commençant par le concept de spillover. Donc, ce concept, la plupart des maladies infectieuses émergentes sont considérées comme zoonotiques, donc passant d'un animal à l'humain. Et ce spillover, c'est ce passage, c'est ce débordement depuis l'animal. Et pour l'instant, la plupart des recherches sont ciblées sur les contacts directs avec l'animal, avec plusieurs conséquences. Hein. Premièrement, un potentiel biais de confirmation, puisqu'on ne trouve que ce qu'on cherche. Deuxièmement, une responsabilisation individuelle. Et puis, une stigmatisation des chasseurs et des consommateurs de viande de brousse pour des maladies africaines, par exemple, mais toujours sur l'individu. Face à cela, il nous semble qu'il y a un continent qui est relativement inexploré, hein, qui sont les contacts indirects inhérents au partage d'un environnement quotidien. Il s'agisse de fruits prémâchés par des animaux, de contacts avec des fécesses animales, des eaux souillées ou des eaux de boisson. Slide, s'il vous plaît. L'autre concept, donc en poursuivant ce raisonnement sur qu'on souhaiterait renouveler, hein, c'est ce concept de réservoir épidémiologique. En effet, récemment, ce concept de réservoir épidémiologique a été restreint au réservoir animal. Mais on se rend compte que dans les anciennes acceptions, hein, au XIXe siècle ou avant, on pouvait parler de lieu plurimicrobien. Donc, il y avait cette notion de lieu qui apparaissait. Et donc là, on aimerait revenir un peu là-dessus et penser donc ce débordement de l'agent infectieux depuis les milieux, depuis ce qu'on pourrait considérer comme des lieux réservoirs, et qui définirait, voilà, l'idée ne serait pas juste de trouver le réservoir animal, mais d'aller comprendre le complexe pathogène d'une maladie, donc tous les acteurs qui rentrent en interaction pour cette émergence. Slide, s'il vous plaît. Donc, pour commencer cette exploration, l'idée est d'aller, par exemple, sur des maladies qu'on connaît moins. Hein. On connaît beaucoup les zoonoses, mais je ne suis pas sûre que tout le monde ait entendu parler de sapronose. Donc, c'est ces maladies qui sont en fait transmises depuis l'environnement, depuis le sol et les matières organiques. Et en fait, c'est des maladies, par exemple, l'anthrax, donc le charbon, qui est une maladie qui est contenue dans le sol et qui est notamment contenue dans le permafrost et qui peut potentiellement se diffuser aux humains et aux animaux, comme ça a été le cas en Sibérie il y a 2 ou 3 ans, où en fait un renne des années 1970 qui était mort de l'anthrax a été décongelé par le changement climatique et a été en contact, donc avec des rennes vivants ont été mis en contact avec et ont développé une épidémie importante. Mais quelque chose d'aussi intéressant, c'est une autre maladie qu'on voit en bas, la coccidiodomycose, qui est un champignon, et en fait qui a touché des pompiers, notamment après les méga-feux l'année dernière aux États-Unis, et où en fait c'est un champignon qui est contenu dans le sol et qui a été libéré par les méga-feux, et deuxièmement qui a été propagé par les fumées qui ont parti. Donc on le voit, c'est d'autres maladies qui sont vraiment en lien avec l'environnement. Slide s'il vous plaît. Et donc ça peut nous amener à aller vers ce qu'on pourrait appeler de la virulence environnementale, et c'est d'ailleurs quelque chose qui était bien connu dans les milieux paysans, même en France, dans le Massif central et dans les Hautes-Alpes. Il y a des prés dans lesquels les paysans ne mettent pas leurs animaux, et parce que c'est connu que ces prés-là sont des prés à anthrax, justement, la même chose que ce qu'on a vu en Sibérie, à charbon, et donc qui étaient des prés maudits. Donc les populations avaient bien cette notion de virulence environnementale. Plus récemment, il y a des travaux sur l'ulcère de Borrelie qui sont menés par Jean-François Guégan, qui est écologue de la santé, et qui partent également de cette caractérisation d'une virulence environnementale des écosystèmes guyanais, et notamment soumis à leur paillage. Et puis un truc intéressant également, c'est qu'en fait les mycobactéries, donc qui sont des bactéries qui causent la tuberculose chez les humains ou chez les animaux, donc on pense qu'il s'agit d'une maladie zoonotique qui est passée de l'animal à l'humain, mais les recherches les plus récentes montrent qu'en fait ces mycobactéries, elles viennent du sol, elles viennent de la tourbe ou de la rhizosphère des plantes, et donc il s'agit finalement de sapronose à l'origine, donc de maladies venues de la Terre. Slide s'il vous plaît. Deuxième approche pour essayer de penser depuis les milieux, ce qu'on appelle la landscape épidémiologie, donc l'épidémiologie des paysages, qui a émergé en URSS dans les années 60, et qui prend le paysage comme cadre de compréhension et d'action sur les maladies, parce que le paysage structure les dynamiques des communautés animales, vectorielles, microbiennes, humaines, avec l'idée de définir des faciès éco-épidémiogènes similaires entre les aires géographiques. Et on le voit, cette façon d'étudier, elle repart des distributions spatiales des maladies infectieuses pour déterminer un peu une sémiologie géographique, donc comme en médecine, mais en étudiant les signes plutôt à partir des territoires. Et on le voit, ça replace la santé comme un enjeu topologique. Slide s'il vous plaît. Donc pour aborder cette influence des paysages sur les maladies infectieuses, on va s'intéresser en fait à plutôt se demander en quoi les trajectoires passées des environnements déterminent les maladies du présent. Et on va prendre pour exemple l'échinococose alvéolaire, sur laquelle j'ai un peu travaillé, qui est une maladie parasitaire, dont les hôtes sont le chien et le renard d'une part, et les petits rongeurs de type campagnol. Et en fait, c'est une maladie qui cause chez l'humain des abcès au foie et qui est assez invalidant. Et puis, ce qui est intéressant, c'est que le renard est aussi censé être impliqué, on le verra. Donc, cette maladie, si on regarde sa répartition en France, c'est absolument flagrant, elle n'est pas répartie partout pareil sur le territoire, donc il se passe quelque chose, bien évidemment, ça peut être des facteurs humains, mais il y a également des facteurs écologiques. Et là, en l'occurrence, ces paysages-là, donc cette zone Massif central et puis Jura et Alpes, sont en fait des zones qui ont été soumises à des transformations agricoles massives dans les années 60, puisque les paysans se sont tournés vers une conversion laitière et une conversion fromagère, et donc ont arrêté le travail du sol et les labours. Et en fait, ça, des années plus tard, des décennies plus tard, ça a favorisé la pullulation de petits campagnols terrestres, dont on a beaucoup entendu parler. Ces campagnols, ils causent des dégâts en agriculture, mais surtout, en termes de santé, ils peuvent favoriser l'échinococose alvéolaire dans ces zones-là. Donc, c'est intéressant puisqu'on voit bien que voilà, la transformation des écosystèmes passés induit des maladies dans le présent. Premier exemple. Je veux bien les slides, s'il vous plaît. Autre exemple d'influence de paysages, on va dire, pathogènes, cette fois-ci côté aquatique, avec la construction de barrages qui, que ce soit en Égypte ou au Sénégal, dans les années 60, mais au Sénégal c'est plus récent, ont causé, derrière la création de ces barrages, de véritables épidémies de bilharziose, donc, qui ont été des problèmes de santé publique très importants. Donc cette maladie, elle fait des problèmes urogénitaux chez l'homme et la femme, et elle se transmet par donc c'est un petit parasite qui fait son cycle dans un milieu aquatique, et notamment dans un petit crustacé qui s'appelle les bulins, et qui est transmise par l'homme par contact cutané. Et en fait, c'est la création de ces barrages, en empêchant par exemple l'eau salée et en modifiant l'écosystème aquatique, ont complètement transformé l'écosystème, on fait perdre les prédateurs de ces petits bulins et on fait proliférer ces petits bulins, ce qui a été responsable de pics de cette maladie. Slide suivante. Donc, on le voit, hein, qu'il s'agisse d'écosystèmes terrestres ou d'écosystèmes aquatiques, on a un peu les mêmes processus qui sont en cours, hein, les modifications sur l'environnement. On passait les écosystèmes de complexes et fonctionnels avec différentes strates à des écosystèmes plus simplifiés, avec des proliférations, perte des prédateurs, extinction de certaines espèces et prolifération d'autres espèces, et notamment d'espèces porteuses de maladies, puisque quand il s'agit de rongeurs ou de vecteurs de type tique ou moustique, cela pose des questions, et ça pose donc, ces écologies simplifiées posent la question de l'habitabilité. Slide suivante. Et donc, pour terminer ce premier passage sur penser les émergences depuis les milieux, il nous semble que toutes ces caractéristiques d'homogénéisation, domestication des écosystèmes, de disruption des chaînes trophiques avec la perte des prédateurs, toutes ces extinctions, toutes ces proliférations et les translocations de populations humaines, animales et vectorielles engendrent des nouvelles promiscuités et peuvent permettre de caractériser cette terre en termes de santé et de maladies infectieuses, de plantationocène, hein, dans la lignée de Donna Haraway, Anna Tsing ou Malcolm Ferdinand, qui nous semble la plus à même de décrire l'époque actuelle en termes de maladies infectieuses émergentes. Slide suivante. Donc, maintenant qu'on a réfléchi ces maladies depuis les milieux, l'idée, c'est de se dire, donc, on ne va plus agir sur les agents infectieux, enfin, en tout cas, on va continuer à agir sur les agents infectieux, mais en parallèle, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire pour prévenir ces émergences en tentant de les approcher aussi depuis les milieux. Slide suivante. Et donc, c'est ce qui est proposé assez largement désormais avec la plateforme intergouvernementale de la biodiversité et des services écosystémiques, l'IPBES, qui propose en fait un changement radical d'une gestion réactive des crises vers la prévention proactive des risques, qui intègre la gestion des écosystèmes et la biologie de la conservation dans les politiques de santé publique, et qui se tourne vers des approches qui sont plus d'écologie de la santé, qui développent une conception plus écologique, écosystémique et évolutive des émergences, non seulement pour les comprendre, mais aussi pour agir dessus. Slide suivante. Donc, un des concepts qui est mobilisé, alors pour l'instant de façon assez limitée, mais ça s'appelle la landscape immunity, donc l'immunité paysagère ou l'immunité des paysages. Et justement, l'idée est de favoriser une intégrité des écosystèmes dans leur fonction et dans leur structure, de favoriser des environnements où les animaux sauvages peuvent vivre et rester, en tout cas peuvent avoir leurs habitats préservés, et donc pour arriver à une immunité paysagère. On va prendre quelques exemples, slide suivante. Donc ça peut passer par de la restauration écologique. Alors là, on va prendre l'exemple de la maladie de Lyme, qui est assez connue, qui n'est pas détaillée avant, mais qui est une maladie donc, transmise par les tiques, qui se nourrissent, elles, soit sur des grands mammifères, soit des petits mammifères. Et en fait, cette maladie aux États-Unis, elle est particulièrement due à la prolifération d'une petite souris qui s'appelle la souris à pattes blanches. Et finalement, les auteurs récemment se sont rendus compte que dans certaines zones des États-Unis, cette souris à pattes blanches et les tiques étaient favorisées par une plante qui est considérée comme invasive et envahissante, l'épinette japonaise. Et ils se sont dit, OK, alors qu'est-ce que ça fait si on détruit un peu cette épinette japonaise qui est censée être exotique envahissante et qu'on restaure un environnement natif. Et ça s'est bien traduit par une diminution des populations de souris à pattes blanches, une diminution des tiques, donc une diminution de l'exposition des humains. Et on le voit, il s'agit d'actions sur l'environnement pour penser la santé. Slide suivante. Un autre exemple est donc en Australie cette fois-ci, donc le virus Endra, qui est un virus qui se transmet des chauves-souris aux chevaux et aux humains ensuite. Et en fait, là, il y a une étude très intéressante faite par des écologues de la santé qui essaient de penser un peu largement. Ils se sont rendus compte, on le voit ici en rose, que les épidémies ne survenaient, de virus Endra chez les humains, ne survenaient que certaines années. Ces années-là sont caractérisées en fait par des années où, sans floraison, de plusieurs arbres qui d'habitude fleurissent en hiver. Donc c'est à chaque fois qu'il y a un hiver sans floraison, il y a ces épidémies. Pourquoi ? Parce qu'en fait, les chauves-souris qui sont impliquées sont des chauves-souris frugivores qui se nourrissent de nectar de fruits. Et les années où elles ne trouvent pas de quoi se nourrir parce que leurs arbres, leur habitat hivernal, soit a été détruit, soit ne fleurit pas, en fait, elles se splittent en différentes colonies et elles vont au contact des terres plus anthropisées, des terres agricoles, et donc peuvent contaminer les humains. Donc l'idée a été de se dire, très bien, puisque c'est comme ça, en fait, ces espèces ont perdu leurs habitats, donc comment restaurer leurs habitats ? Donc bien sûr, ça passe par la préservation, mais ça passe aussi par, donc là, ils ont replanté des arbres qui fleurissent en hiver, et ils ont reconstitué des habitats pour tenter de lutter contre cette maladie. Donc on le voit, vraiment, les politiques de santé commencent à infiltrer les politiques d'aménagement du territoire. Slide suivant. Autre exemple de faire advenir des paysages, une immunité paysagère, on va dire, c'est en tout cas une écologie qui permette de se préserver des maladies infectieuses. On aimerait juste parler ici d'une méta-analyse qui a eu lieu sur le rôle des prédateurs en santé, et qui est assez intéressante parce que on ne se rend pas forcément compte du rôle que peuvent avoir plusieurs espèces. Donc, plusieurs amphibiens, par exemple, chauves-souris ou oiseaux, ont un vrai rôle dans le fait de manger des œufs, des larves ou des moustiques eux-mêmes et de limiter les maladies vectorielles. Mais il y a également le rôle des léopards, par exemple, qui peuvent manger des chiens dans les zones urbaines d'Afrique et limiter ainsi la rage humaine. Slide suivante. Ça peut aller plus près de chez nous par la prévention d'une maladie qui s'appelle la peste porcine africaine, alors qui ne touche pas les humains, qui touche les cochons et les sangliers, mais qui est très préoccupante en Europe pour les conséquences économiques qu'elle peut avoir. Et on voit ici en Slovaquie, cette carte de Slovaquie, qui met en évidence les petits points là où sont les épidémies de peste porcine africaine, qu'il s'agit des élevages ou des sangliers touchés. Et en fait, on voit que les zones touchées sont des zones où il n'y a pas de meute de loup. Et les zones avec meute de loup et prédation efficace sont des zones quasiment indemnes de la maladie, et ce qui s'explique bien sûr par le rôle d'une part de tuer les animaux malades que sont les loups, et d'autre part de nettoyer également les carcasses et donc d'éviter la dissémination. Suivante. Dernier exemple sur les rôles des prédateurs, donc la bilharziose dont on a parlé tout à l'heure, cette maladie aquatique. Donc on l'a vu, elle était en lien avec la prolifération de ces petits bulins, ces petits crustacés, donc, et la disparition des prédateurs de ces crustacés. Donc il y a eu des réintroductions de ces prédateurs, notamment au Sénégal ici, qui sont soit les langoustines, soit les grosses crevettes. Et 18 mois plus tard, donc, le nombre d'escargots infectés a été diminué et les nouvelles contaminations ont également reculé. Slide suivante. Cependant, j'aimerais, donc voilà, on le voit, ces solutions fondées sur la nature sont en train qu'on appelle comme ça, sont en train de se multiplier, et cependant, je pense qu'il y a une grande vigilance à avoir là-dessus, puisque finalement, est-ce que ça sort vraiment d'une logique gestionnaire et utilitariste? Est-ce que ça sort d'une éthique complètement anthropocentrée? Pas toutes les expériences qu'on a montrées, pas forcément. Et juste une vigilance là-dessus, parce que par exemple, dans cette anthropologue Sophie Chao qui mène des enquêtes dans les plantations d'huile de palme en Papouasie occidentale, met en évidence que les planteurs utilisent des chouettes effraies qu'ils relâchent la nuit, qu'ils tiennent en cage le jour et qu'ils relâchent la nuit pour lutter contre les proliférations de rongeurs dans les plantations. Et on voit bien là qu'on n'est pas du tout dans une logique à reconstituer des écologies diversifiées et sauvages, on est juste dans une logique gestionnaire et utilitariste, ce qui n'est pas ce qu'on souhaiterait porter. Slide suivant. Donc vraiment l'idée, elle est, en voulant reconstituer ces écologies, c'est plutôt et préserver et reconstituer, c'est plutôt de préserver les mondes qui vont avec, pour aboutir à une réelle santé multispécifique qui déplace de l'éthique anthropocentrée, comme on voit en bas à gauche, vers une éthique évo- et éco-centrée, donc centrée sur l'évolution et l'écologie, et puis vers des restaurations qui permettent l'expression des potentialités du vivant et qui ne sont pas uniquement gestionnaires. D'autre part, l'idée est de faire face aussi à des formes d'universalisation, donc c'est plutôt d'avoir des approches plurielles, locales et spécifiques, comme on le voit, sans solution clé en main. Diapo suivante. Donc l'idée, c'est de passer de ces environnements pathogènes subis et qui sont globaux vers des territoires de santé partagés, donc vraiment à l'échelle territoriale. Slide suivant. Désolée, ça manque de fluidité. Et parce qu'on le voit bien, tous les paysages, toutes les parties ne sont pas concernés par les mêmes maladies. Un milieu forestier, un milieu aquatique, un milieu urbain ne sera pas concerné par les mêmes maladies. Une zone très anthropisée, comme on voit ici en rouge à droite, ou des zones beaucoup plus naturelles ne seront pas soumises aux mêmes maladies. Et on voit à gauche 3 répartitions de maladies différentes en France. Maladie de Lyme en haut à gauche, hantavirus, qui est d'autres virus qui nous arrivent en bas à gauche, et puis la grippe aviaire pour ce qui est au milieu. On voit bien que ce sont le long des bassins aquatiques. Donc l'idée, c'est de se dire qu'il nous faut penser et agir sur les maladies infectieuses, non pas depuis une biologie universelle, mais depuis ces territoires, depuis ces biorégions qui ont une signification aussi épidémiologique. Slide suivante. Donc, juste 2 exemples. L'idée, c'est d'agir donc depuis l'échelle territoriale, de favoriser la prise de conscience des personnes qu'il y a des liens entre biodiversité et santé et peut-être agir donc sur cette préservation et cette restauration des socio-écosystèmes à l'échelle des territoires. C'est ce qui est fait par Serge Morand, on voit en bas à droite, en Thaïlande, qui est un écologue de la santé qui travaille à la fois sur les populations de rongeurs et leur santé, les animaux et leur santé, la santé de l'environnement, la santé des humains, et qui fait participer les communautés. Et puis, slide suivante, j'aimerais juste vous parler d'un autre exemple d'approche territoriale en termes de santé auquel j'ai pu participer, qui porte sur l'échinococose alvéolaire. Donc, on a vu tout à l'heure le petit parasite qui pullulait chez les campagnols et les renards. Et en fait, a été mis un projet dans la zone atelier du Jura, mené par Patrick Giraudoux, le projet Carelli. Et en fait, ce projet, il consiste à déterminer la séroprévalence de l'échinococose alvéolaire sur les fesses de renard, à la fois dans des zones où le renard est classé espèce protégée et donc pas abattu, et dans des zones où il est chassé et classé comme espèce nuisible, en comparaison de ces zones-là. Donc déjà, c'est une originalité du projet, hein, puisqu'en plus, c'est un projet sur le long terme. Mais ce qui est vraiment original, c'est qu'ils ont impliqué dans ce projet toutes les parties prenantes d'un territoire, c'est-à-dire à la fois les associations naturalistes, comme la LPO, le FNE, et à la fois les chasseurs, et à la fois les agriculteurs, dont les agriculteurs de la FDSEA, accompagnés par des chercheurs. Et ce programme, il a été construit depuis le début, ce qui permet d'une part de mieux faire accepter les résultats à terme, puisque tout le monde aura participé à toutes les étapes, et d'autre part, ça permet surtout de mettre en contact les différents acteurs du territoire en créant d'autres relations, puisque quand on ramasse ensemble, qu'on fait du terrain ensemble, c'est pas la même chose. Et donc de renforcer pour les personnes les liens entre santé et biodiversité à l'échelle des territoires. Slide suivante. Donc pour conclure, deux diapos, il me semble qu'on l'a vu, ainsi les environnements actuels sont des déterminants des maladies infectieuses et qu'on peut les lier à ce qu'on appelle le plantationnocène. Est-ce qu'il ne serait pas question d'aller vers ce que Christine Chivalon appelle contre-plantationnocène, en s'inspirant des jardins qui étaient mis en place par les esclaves autour des plantations et qui étaient des jardins absolument profus et multispécifiques et qui étaient donc en gros contraste avec ces zones de plantation. Et donc l'idée, ce serait de se demander qu'est-ce que voudraient ces réensauvagements en termes de santé, hein, que ce soit le fait de favoriser des écologies diversifiées et sauvages au niveau des paysages, ou encore de réaffirmer ce rôle des prédateurs en santé. Slide suivante. Et donc, pour terminer, pour penser ces habitabilités en termes de santé, dans les suites d'Anating, qui propose de quitter les proliférations anthropocéniques pour aller préserver et restaurer des résurgences holocéniques et raviver les capacités de résurgence multi-espèces, il me semble que c'est ce qui peut être important. Et voilà, merci. Dernière slide, mais merci beaucoup.
Merci. Merci beaucoup Camille, merci Anne-Sophie pour les diapos et pour tout le reste d'ailleurs. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle? Oui, Gaël je crois, hein, c'est ça. Ouais. On va donner la priorité à la salle, donc soit en anglais soit en français, mais bon, plutôt en anglais les questions, si c'est possible, à moins qu'elles soient très très ciblées sur certaines thématiques de Camille.
In English then. About the metabolic activity of the Brittany agro-food system, I was wondering whether the fact that we are having discussion about the taxation of deforestation product, would it completely rock the boat of Brittany's agriculture? Apparently, very much of Brittany's agricultural food system is based on the importation of cereals and proteins from Brazil. Do you think that the fact that we're dragging our feet to tax imported deforestation is related to that? And what would it entail to tax deforestation product for Brittany's agriculture and for the resilience of our food system?
No, yes, it's a very open question. I'm not sure I have all the answer, but one thing is that the soy that is imported from Brazil or other Latin American country is not necessarily due to immediate deforestation. The deforestation may have occurred 20 years ago, so this may not impact the soy that is imported. That is one first part of the answer. And the second is that, yes, if the soy imported is imported from deforested land, then a tax may apply and then increase the cost of the farmers. So I don't know how this will impact or change the Breton agri-food system, but one thing is sure is that the indebtedness is already very high. So will it increase the indebtedness so much that it become economically impossible to keep doing the farming as it is now, or will it just increase a little bit the economic charge and just create an even more how to say the opposite of virtual circle, the vicious circle, where it's even more impossible to get out of a system when you are so much indebted. So yes.
I think there was a question, yeah, in the middle of the. Good morning. Thank you again for your presentations. I'm wondering how relevant is the frequent analogy between what an ecosystem is and living organisms, which we find easily in the last presentations. When you use, for example, concepts of metabolism and also landscape immunity. So, of course, I understand the impact of an analogy, but also the possible dangers. Would you say that, I don't know, something like the Haber-Bosch procedé is like a mitochondria, and the walls are acting as a kind of globule blanc. I don't know how to say it, but okay, just to make you feeling that there are some dangers in this direction, and I don't know if there are some studies trying to identify what these dangers may be.
Je pense que tu peux y aller parce que pour le coup c'est Camille, peut-être tu veux répondre en premier.
Camille, do you want to answer also? Je sais pas si Camille est encore là.
Si.
Elle est là?
C'est bon, Camille est là.
Mais je sais pas si elle m'entend ou si elle nous entend. Okay.
Sinon, je peux commencer.
Commencer, voilà.
No, it's a very interesting question. I fully agree that there is many dangers with the organism metaphor, and there was actually a book written by Judith Schlanger in 1972 about les métaphores de l'organisme, which pointed toward these dangers that considering the society as an organism might lead also to consider, yes, there is each things in society have its place, and it is necessary to have an harmonious functioning of the society, just as for an organism, which can also be used by a Darwinian, social Darwinian approach to say, okay, this is a tumor of society, so it has to be removed. And I fully agree about this very dangerous things. But I believe that the socio-ecological metabolism as defined in a Marxist conception avoid two pitfalls. So one is a biologization of societies, because this is not about thinking society as a natural organism, but understanding the relationship between human societies and their environment through a tangible object that is material fluxes. And this is just somehow methodological metaphors that in organism, metabolism is all the fluxes that are necessary to maintain and reproduce the organism, and similarly in a society, all the fluxes are used to reproduce and maintain a society, but this does not mean that this cannot change and this has not evolved a lot across time, and that it will keep changing, and that the history is open to various ways to have agencies between societies and their environment. And the other pitfall is the cultural pitfall that sees the societies only as a cultural construction, that sees the societies only through the perceptions of the environment, and to re-embed societies within its material conditions. So I believe the socio-ecological metabolism allows to do this.
Yes, I have 3 questions. First, thank you very much for this panel. That was very interesting. The first question is for Camille. I was very interested by your rewilding proposition, as I am working on rewilding cities, especially through schoolyards or other places. But I see the problem with the normative ecology. I mean, what kind of model of rewilding are we applying? I am trying to reintroduce arthropods, insects in schoolyards, not knowing what this means in terms of health, and especially for kids. So, okay, I am a bit, thinking like you do, that it would be good as a general system, but practically at the local scales and even at the city scales, we don't know what that produce. That was the first question.
Maybe she can start with that.
What?
Maybe she can start with the first answer.
Oh, okay.
On a perdu Camille. Camille is not there anymore.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. But do you have questions for the other speakers?
Yeah, I mean, that was more a question of scales.
It's a good question, actually, but we will not be able to answer.
Well, this is because we're very much anchored into critique. And we don't know very much how to propose these kind of models to policymakers or even to engineer different landscape and different ways of acting. So to you, Mark Williams, there was the question of scales, because I know very much what you're talking about, but sometimes when I'm discussing with the TTO of Paris regarding the action plan for climate, I wonder how much you can grasp this kind of data and make something of it, even if you're willing. And that's something that has to do with translation, I guess. But how do you translate that in a model that has meaning for policymakers? And that's the same for you, because I work with Sabine Barl, so I know very well her work and also the other works. But sometimes it lacks of translation issues, and...
Go on.
It's a really good... Short answer is quite difficult. Yeah. I was really struck by what Clémence and Julia showed in Brittany about the way in which people moved away from the land into cities. And that also connects, I think, with some of the questions about farming in Brittany and more broadly. If you think about the global context of meat production, for example, you know that the human population has doubled since the 1960s, and the per capita meat consumption has also doubled. So it's kind of logarithmic. And that simply isn't sustainable on a... So I'm trying to draw a thread between the different comments. And so you're talking about cities and the way that cities should be rewilded, which I think is a really good way to go. But I think we need to have a wholesale reconsideration of how cities function within the broader biosphere. So we did some simple back-of-the-envelope calculations to look at the energy consumption of cities relative to their natural biome. The amount of light coming in, the amount of light that can be trapped in chemical energy in plants and then can obviously circulates through the ecology. And when you start to do that and look at cities in terms of their energy consumption, it's orders and orders of magnitude beyond what is available in the natural habitat. So I think that the conversation has to be much broader. It has to be, and I kind of alluded to it when I talked about hyperconsumption, we have to start talking about degrowth. And that might come back again. It's kind of reversing some of the processes that, I was shocked actually by the figures that Clémence and Julia showed. I thought that was an amazing presentation because it brings it down to the regional level. But unless we start to think as humans about the way in which we consume and we start to consume less, then everything we're discussing here will not solve the massive problem that we have. Rewilding is a part of it, but the bigger issue is the sheer amount of consumption going on in wealthy Western cities. It was polemic, sorry.
Who has a question? Jérôme has a question, you mean? No. Okay, go on.
I had a very provocative question for Camille, but she's not here anymore. And I still have 2 questions. pretty quick, I would say. First one is for Mark. So you said that your indexes go from 2 to 5 and are linked to, from 2 to 5 are linked to oxygen. I was wondering if actually you had thought about having a sort of index 5 not related to any oxygen metabolisms. What has been shown just before, I think energy is different, but it's something you can comment on. And I have also a question for Julia and Clémence. It's about the case of Brittany, which is well known here in France. But do you have the same kind of cases in Europe or US? Okay, something very active, a territory very active. Do you have some examples that are quite similar in different countries in the world, actually?
You might want to answer first.
Don't be too polite.
Okay. It's between two Brits. We've got to be super polite.
It's an endless question of how you define different states of the biosphere.
So. Right. Okay.
Use the microphone.
I'm not sure we've actually been doing some studies elsewhere. I know we've been in the seminar that we've co-organized. We've been looking at the Reunion Island. So definitely very far away from kind of continental France, I would say. And I think, haven't you published a paper on? Yeah, you might want to.
Yes, we made the same thing at the European level, but looking at all territory in Europe. And one thing that is interesting in that when you look at the national level, it may seem you make the figures I did at the national level that there is kind of a complementarity between livestock farming and cropping systems. But it's only when you look into the territorial level that you realize that in many countries, so this includes, for instance, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, Great Britain, Germany, Denmark, there are these specialization at the territorial level with some territory very much specialized in livestock farming. So this is somehow a paradox, because at the national level there would be the possibility to integrate livestock farming activity together with cropping system, but they are not, and actually the livestock is fed both by national crop forage, but also very much on South America soy imports. So the reason for that must be found very much in the geopolitical arrangement of the agricultural system. There is no geographic, there is no biophysical rationale behind this. There is only an economic and the geopolitical rationale that explain these arrangements.
Do you want me to answer the question on the biosphere? Yeah. So this is a question about a biosphere in an anoxic state and one in an oxygenated state. The reason we chose those as index 1 and index 2 was, so index 1 was a prokaryotic biosphere using anoxygenic processes, which can include photosynthesis. And the biosphere index state 2 is one that's using the ubiquitous materials of water, light, carbon dioxide, so it becomes a more global biosphere, more energetic biosphere. So that was the difference between state 1 and state 2. There is a really interesting question in there, though, because sorry, I didn't mean to say that your question wasn't interesting. There's another really interesting question there, because one can argue, of course, that when the oxygenated biosphere gets going, the previous biosphere is subsumed, it's suppressed in effect, and there are some parallels for what's going on at present, because human ecosystems are really suppressing and oppressing the natural biosphere around us. I think there's quite an interesting parallel there.
Maybe one last question. Go on.
Hi. Thank you for your interesting presentations. Here's a downbeat question. In terms of the biosphere, the analogy that's always most struck me is that humans represent weevils in a bag of flour, and eventually that bag of flour becomes toxic. You can get there quickly, and I think you can get there slowly if you engage in rehabilitation, but you eventually get there. So surely the bigger issue is to get off this planet and find another biosphere. I was wondering how people would respond to that.
I wanted to ask the same kind of Elon Musk question.
I can have a go.
No, you would go for it, definitely.
Okay, last answer and after that.
The question is, where is it? You know, even the nearest potential habitable planets are tens of light years away, and our technology is nowhere near as getting there, and we'd probably have to exhaust the entire energy of the solar system to get there. So you have to make this a really good planet and not destroy it. Going somewhere else is I'll be polite. I won't say what I think about it.
That's a high-risk solution, right? I mean, my understanding is that we can get out to the solar system. We've got 400 years of breathing in space to solve some problems to get on beyond there. I mean, yeah, and straight line the solar system, straight line everything. That's what humans do.
So I think there's a moral question about that, because we don't even know if there is a biosphere on Mars. So if we start to inhabit Mars, we may be just recapitulating all of the problems that we've had from the past. I mean, we've heard about the plantation scene. It's the same kind of process over and over again, and it's not moral. I'm being kind.
And it's also a question of health, because traveling in space is not safe at this point for a long period of time. We have to finish. On termine donc cette session. Je voudrais remercier encore sincèrement les différents intervenantes et intervenants de cette session, également l'équipe technique et Anne-Sophie, voilà, l'ensemble des personnes qu'on ne voit pas parce qu'ils ont pu s'adapter extrêmement rapidement à une situation qui était compliquée. On remercie Camille, même si elle ne nous entend plus. Et on se donne rendez-vous donc à 14h pour la suite de ce formidable séminaire.